There are no lines at the airport, no delays at security, no overbooked flights, no rush to board, and somehow, that's the problem, because the system you were told was too busy to fail has gone quiet. The departure boards still glow. The duty-free lights are still on. Luxury lounges are still stocked with champagne no one is drinking, but the passengers are gone. Airports that once processed tens of millions of people a year now echo with something they were never designed to contain: absence. Hotels that prided themselves on exclusivity are suddenly available to anyone, entire floors empty. Infinity pools reflecting nothing but sky. From the outside, everything still looks operational. The music is still playing. The infrastructure is still intact, but the rhythm is wrong, because what you're seeing isn't a shutdown, it's something far more dangerous. A system still running, without the flow it depends on. And once that flow disappears, the illusion doesn't collapse immediately, it lingers. Just long enough to make you question whether anything is wrong at all, until you realize this wasn't built to survive silence. Asterisk, at first glance, nothing about this should be happening. Global travel demand, at least on paper, is still strong. Luxury tourism hasn't disappeared. Airlines haven't gone bankrupt overnight, and yet the corridors are empty. The contradiction is precise. How can a system built on constant movement suddenly stall without warning? How can billion-dollar infrastructure airports, resorts, entire districts remain physically untouched and still begin to fail? Because what's breaking here isn't visible in concrete or glass. It's something deeper, something quieter, and far more fragile. Before we peel back what's really happening beneath this surface, the mechanics, the dependencies, the structure most people never see. This channel exists for exactly this kind of analysis. Not headlines, not surface-level narratives, but the hidden systems underneath them. If that's the kind of thinking you value, consider subscribing, because what we're about to uncover is not just about empty airports, it's about why they were never meant to be empty in the first place. Asterisk, to understand the silence, you have to understand the noise that came before it, because this system, this global network of aviation, luxury hospitality, and transit economies wasn't built gradually. It was engineered over the past 3 decades. A new kind of economic model emerged, not based on manufacturing, not based on natural resources alone, but on movement, the movement of people, the movement of capital, the movement of attention. Airports became more than infrastructure. They became economic engines. Cities positioned themselves not as destinations, but as connectors, places. You didn't just visit, but passed through. And in doing so, they unlocked something powerful. Scale. Airlines expanded routes to hundreds of destinations. Airports processed tens of millions, then nearly 100 million passengers annually. Hotels multiplied, not just to meet demand, but to anticipate it. Luxury became standardized. 5-star wasn't rare anymore. It was expected. Entire coastlines were redesigned to accommodate it. Artificial islands, master-planned districts, retail environments calibrated for global spending patterns. Everything was optimized for one assumption, that the flow would never stop. And for a while, it didn't. Passenger numbers climbed year after year. Tourism revenues surged into the hundreds of billions globally. Occupancy rates held at levels that made even the most optimistic projections look conservative. From the outside, it looked unstoppable, a perfect machine. Self-reinforcing, self-expanding, too integrated to fail. But inside that expansion, there was a trade-off, one that wasn't obvious at first, because the more efficient the system became, the less tolerance it had for disruption. There were no buffers, no excess capacity designed for resilience. Every seat, every room, every route was calibrated for utilization, for constant demand, for uninterrupted flow, which meant that when the flow slowed, even slightly, the system didn't bend, it amplified the pressure. Empty seats don't just represent lost revenue, they cascade through pricing models, route viability, fuel economics, staffing structures. Empty rooms don't just affect hotels, they ripple into retail, food supply chains, labor markets. And because everything is connected, the effects don't stay contained, they spread. Quietly at first, then all at once. But even that isn't the deepest layer, because what made this system powerful also made it vulnerable in a way few people fully understood it. It wasn't just built on movement. It was built on something even less stable, something that doesn't appear on balance sheets, something that can't be engineered, expanded, or forced. Confidence. And once that begins to shift, the entire structure starts behaving differently. Not immediately, not visibly, but inevitably. The first sign wasn't the cancellations. It wasn't the empty terminals. It wasn't even the sudden drop in hotel occupancy. It was something far easier to ignore. Prices long before the corridors went quiet, the system had already started adjusting. Luxury hotels properties, built on the promise of exclusivity, began lowering rates, not dramatically. Not enough to trigger headlines, just enough to fill rooms. A 1% decline here, a 2% adjustment there, framed as seasonal optimization, packaged as strategic pricing, but beneath that language was a simple reality. Supply was outpacing demand, and not by a little. New hotels continued to open, more rooms, more suites, more premium experiences, all targeting the same segment, the same travelers, the same finite pool of global demand. At first, it worked. Discount slightly, fill more rooms, maintain the appearance of growth. But that strategy has a limit, because once everyone starts doing it, you're no longer competing on brand, you're competing on price. And the moment luxury competes on price, it stops being luxury. That was the first crack, small, quiet, easy to dismiss, but it revealed something structural. This wasn't a system with infinite demand. It was a system dependent on constant expansion, new visitors, new routes, new reasons to come. And when those reasons begin to plateau, the math changes. Occupancy becomes harder to sustain. Margins compress. Expectations adjust downward. But even then, the system kept moving, because as long as people were still arriving, the illusion could hold. Until suddenly, they weren't. The disruption didn't begin as a collapse. It began as protocol, a few flight suspensions, route adjustments, temporary restrictions, standard responses to rising geopolitical tension, nothing the system hadn't handled before. But this time, the geography itself became the problem. Airspace, normally invisible to passengers, turned into a constraint. Flight paths that once connected continents in efficient arcs were suddenly unavailable. Airlines had two choices, reroute or cancel. Rerouting meant longer distances, higher fuel costs, crew limitations, scheduling breakdowns across entire networks. For some routes, it simply didn't work, so cancellations began at first in the hundreds, then the thousands, and within days, tens of thousands. Airports that functioned as global crossroads, handling massive transit flows between Asia, Europe, and beyond, lost their primary advantage, connectivity, because these hubs were never just destinations, they were bridges. And when the bridge is compromised, traffic doesn't slow, it diverts. Passengers don't wait indefinitely. Airlines don't operate unprofitable routes out of loyalty. They adapt, new paths emerge. Alternative hubs absorb the overflow. Different cities, previously secondary, become primary. And here's the part most people miss. Once those patterns change, they don't automatically revert, because travel isn't just about availability, it's about habit. Frequent flyer programs shift. Corporate travel policies update. Airline alliances recalibrate. Entire ecosystems realign around new routes, so even if the disruption is temporary, its effects aren't what looks like a short-term shock. Quietly rewrites long-term behavior, and for a system built entirely on flow, that's not a disruption, it's a structural threat. Once the flow breaks, the numbers follow, and the numbers don't lie. Occupancy rates don't decline gradually. They drop from levels that once hovered above 80% to barely above 20%. Rooms that were booked months in advance, suddenly canceled in waves. Hundreds of thousands of reservations gone. Air travel capacity collapses. Entire segments of routes disappear. Tourism spending, once measured in billions per week, begins evaporating by the day. But the most important shift isn't the scale, it's the speed, because systems like this aren't designed for slowdowns. Designed for continuity, fixed costs remain constant. Staff still need to be paid. Infrastructure still needs to be maintained. Airports don't get cheaper to operate when they're empty. Hotels don't become sustainable at low occupancy, so pressure builds. Immediately, operators begin making decisions they never planned for. Discount deeper, cut costs. Delay expansions. Reevaluate projections that once seemed guaranteed. And behind closed doors, a different question starts emerging. What if the demand doesn't come back the same way? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Not all demand is equal. Some of it is structural, driven by necessity, business travel, logistics, trade. But a significant portion, especially in luxury tourism, is discretionary, optional. And optional demand is the first to disappear, and the last to return. Which means the recovery curve isn't symmetrical. What falls quickly doesn't necessarily rise at the same speed, and in the gap between those two timelines, the system has to survive. Many don't, because the model was never built for interruption. It was built for acceleration. Asterisk. But even this, the oversupply, the cancellations, the cascading losses, is still only the surface, because underneath all of it is a deeper dependency, one that isn't immediately visible. This entire system, airports, airlines, luxury hotels, retail ecosystems, is built on something incredibly specific. Mobile capital. And mobile populations. People who don't just travel, but spend, invest, transit, consume at scale, and more importantly, they choose where to do it. That's the key, because unlike traditional economic models where activity is tied to geography, resources, or permanent populations, this model depends on choice. People can go somewhere else, capital can move somewhere else, attention can shift somewhere else. And when everything is optimized for attracting that flow, you become extremely sensitive to where it goes next, which creates a paradox. The more successful you are at attracting global flows, the less control you have over keeping them, because you don't own the demand. You compete for it constantly against other cities, other regions, other experiences. And that competition isn't static, it evolves. New destinations emerge, new infrastructure is built, new narratives are created. Some offer lower costs, others offer deeper cultural identity, others offer something even more powerful, novelty, and in a system driven by attention. Novelty is currency, which means even without a crisis, the flow can shift. But when a crisis does occur, geopolitical, economic, or otherwise, it doesn't just interrupt the system, it accelerates that shift, forcing travelers, airlines, and capital to explore alternatives they might not have considered otherwise. And once they do, the question isn't whether they'll return, it's whether they need to while the silence spread through terminals and hotel corridors. Somewhere else, the opposite was happening, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, because in a system defined by movement, when one corridor closes, another one opens, and the shift doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. New routes get tested. Alternative hubs absorb redirected traffic. Airlines begin optimizing for different geographies. At first, it looks temporary, a workaround, but then something subtle happens. The workaround starts working. Passengers realize the alternative isn't worse. In some cases, it's better, shorter layover, less congestion, different experiences, and most importantly, no disruption, because stability, in moments like this, becomes the most valuable luxury of all. Not five-star service, not architectural spectacle, predictability. And once travelers experience a system that feels more predictable, they adjust. Preferences shift. Corporate travel managers update routing strategies. Airlines strengthen partnerships in new regions. Tourism boards redirect marketing budgets. Quietly, the map changes, not all at once, but enough, because here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Competition in this space isn't just about building something better. It's about being available when others aren't. And that's a low bar, but an incredibly powerful one, because availability creates habit, and habit, over time, becomes loyalty. So what looks like a temporary redistribution of traffic can become permanent reallocation, not because one system collapsed completely, but because another proved it could function when it mattered most. Up until now, everything we've discussed, pricing pressure, flight cancellations, shifting routes can be measured, quantified, modeled, explained through data. But the most important variable in this entire system doesn't show up in numbers. Confidence, because the true product being sold here was never just travel. It was certainty. The certainty that flights will operate, that connections will hold, that experiences will match expectations, that nothing will go wrong. For years, that certainty was taken for granted. It became invisible, and when something becomes invisible, it's usually because it's been consistent for so long that no one questions it anymore. Until suddenly, they do. And the moment confidence is questioned, behavior changes immediately. Not after the crisis, not after official statements. During bookings get delayed. Plans get reconsidered. Alternatives get explored because uncertainty doesn't need to materialize. Fully to have an impact, it only needs to exist. And once it exists, it spreads quietly through conversations, through corporate policies, through subtle shifts in perception. It might not be the best time. Let's wait and see. Maybe we should consider other options. That's how it starts, not with panic, but with hesitation, and hesitation is enough, because this system doesn't need people to stop traveling. It only needs them to hesitate long enough for the flow to weaken, and once that happens, everything else follows at its core. This isn't just a story about empty airports or closed hotels. It's a story about a model, a very specific kind of economic architecture that prioritizes scale, speed, and spectacle, but trades off something in return. Resilience, because when a system is optimized for maximum efficiency, maximum occupancy, maximum throughput, maximum growth, it removes the margins that allow it to absorb shocks. There is no idle capacity, no built-in redundancy, no tolerance for interruption. Everything must keep moving, and as long as it does, the results are extraordinary, record-breaking passenger numbers, explosive tourism growth, global recognition. But the moment movement slows, even briefly, the same efficiency that drove success becomes the source of fragility, because there's no buffer, no pause button, just a continuous equation that needs to be solved every single day. Fill the seats, fill the rooms, maintain the flow, and if you can't, the system doesn't gradually adjust, it snaps into correction. Prices drop, margins compress, debt becomes harder to service, expansion plans stall, and what once looked like unstoppable momentum reveals itself as something else, entirely dependency on conditions that can't be controlled, geopolitics, global mobility, perception, variables that exist far outside the system itself, which means the system isn't self-sustaining, it's conditional and conditions. Change asterisk. So now we arrive at the question that sits underneath everything you've just seen, not about the crisis itself, but about what comes after, because eventually the airspace will reopen, flights will resume, passengers will return, at least some of them will. Occupancy rates will climb again, hotels will refill, airports will regain their rhythm, and from the outside, it may look like a recovery, a return to normal. But here's the question that matters. Normal. Based on what? The same assumptions, the same dependencies, the same belief that the flow is guaranteed. Because if nothing changes, if the system simply resets and continues, then the vulnerability doesn't disappear. It compounds, becomes larger, more expensive, more exposed, waiting for the next disruption. And there will be one. Maybe not the same kind, maybe not the same trigger, but in a world defined by constant change. Another interruption isn't a possibility, it's an inevitability. So the real question isn't whether the system will recover, it's whether it will adapt or simply rebuild itself, exactly as it was before. Asterisk, because what you're looking at here isn't just a moment, it's a pattern. One that has repeated across industries, across regions, across decades. Rapid growth, peak confidence, hidden fragility, sudden disruption, and then a choice to evolve. Or to repeat, this channel exists to break down those patterns, to look past the surface and understand what's really driving the systems around us. If you find value in that kind of analysis, subscribe, and let me know your perspective in the comments, because the most important part of this story isn't what already happened, it's what comes next if the flow returns. If the lights stay on, If the airports fill, again, what replaces the illusion of certainty? And more importantly, what replaces it when people stop believing in it?